Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Day on Google Open Source Live. This is a monthly series of sessions led today by DEI experts from Google and community leaders. We really appreciate everyone taking the time to come here together online to learn more about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how to incorporate real change into your work. My name is Faisal Qasimali, also known as Mr. Faisal across all social media. I'm an engineering manager here at Google, and I'm located in Seattle, where I live with my 5-month-old puppy, Penny, who may or may not make herself heard today. Fair warning.
And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, Faisal. My name is Sophia Vargas, and I am a program manager within Google's Open Source Programs Office. You can find me on Twitter as Sophia_IV. I'm usually located in Manhattan in New York City, but I'm currently calling in from Narragansett, Rhode Island. So if you're looking to learn more about diversity, equity, and inclusion, you're in the right place. We have some really interesting talks and sessions and discussions here for you today. We're going to kick it off with a session from Carolyn, who's going to be exploring the butterfly effect for open source diversity, equity, and inclusion through her experience in running and building the Git Contributor Inclusion Summit. But before that, we have a few housekeeping items to address. Don't forget to put your questions in the live QA forum below the live stream window. If you're viewing in full screen, you're going to have to exit the full screen to be able to see this forum. All of our sessions have been pre-recorded, and this allows for more accurate transcripts, but it also allows speakers to be able to focus on answering your questions live in real time during their sessions. Once we're done, don't forget to join us at the after party, which is going to be hosted on Google Meet. We'll share a link to the Google Meet at the end of the session, at the end of the last session. With that, enjoy and welcome to the event.
Hi, I'm Carmenando with Google. I'd like to talk about the Git Contributor Inclusion Summit, a butterfly effect for open source diversity, equity, and inclusion. In 2020, amidst a global pandemic that shone a spotlight on structural inequities, a Black man named George Floyd was killed by a police officer in Minneapolis. Not brutally or violently, but by 8 minutes of callous indifference to a Black man's life at the hands of a person who was supposed to serve and protect. The fallout was far and wide. Communities all over the world exploded into protest. In offices and homes, it sparked conversations about race and justice, conversations that have been happening in Black communities for decades. These made their way into the national dialogue over 50 years ago in the first civil rights movement of the 1960s, and were taken up anew 6 years ago with the start of Black Lives Matter, culminating in 2020 as a global racial reckoning, one that had garnered mainstream worldwide attention. These images were taken in Nairobi, Paris, and Cologne, Germany. The collage on the lower right honors the many Black lives taken at the hands of police or the justice system over many years. You may find yourself asking, what does this have to do with open source software development? With this reckoning, in order to understand and make sense of these events, many of us in tech and in open source looked inward to see how to affect change in areas of our lives that we had influence over. This story is an example of how one small group looked to be the change they wished to see in the world. This talk is for anyone who wants to make open source a place that is more inclusive, representational, and equitable for all. This includes developers, maintainers, organizers of events, or any open source enthusiast that wants to know where they can start. This talk comes in 4 parts, and my goal is to take the diff of where we are and where we need to be, with a roadmap of how to get there. This includes contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance. As the descriptions allude, these 4 parts take a journey from a moral, philosophical, societal, reflective journey into the operational nitty-gritty details, because both the vision and the execution details are needed for change. In this way, I hope that everyone understands how these approaches complement each other. To contemplate is to think profoundly and at length. In this context, we ask ourselves, what is open source? How do open source projects reflect a larger global society? And where can they improve? Open source is not just code. It's made by and for people. Open source is fundamentally a vision for how humans can work together to create works of greater good. For developers and maintainers, that meant looking within projects, both code and products, processes, tooling, and the way project members collaborate and produce the code. Open source is people. But although open source is people, it's not everybody. This is from the most recent Stack Overflow Global Developer Survey. We see 7 out of every 10 developers are white. This is the survey by gender, which represents an even wider discrepancy. 9 out of 10 developers are men. The 2020 racial reckoning needed to become and became a larger reckoning on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. From a logical standpoint, the representation found in open source projects should closely resemble the demographics of the world, yet it does not. It is still widely overrepresented by men of white or European descent. Understanding the reasons behind this overrepresentation, why and how it happens, is the key to fixing it. I like this quote by Craig Owens. Representation then is not, nor can it be neutral. It is an act, indeed the founding act, of power in our culture. And this is where we come to talk about one set of maintainers in one open source project who came together to improve their DEI. That project is the Git Source Control Management tool. In order to give a bit of context, I'm going to take a step back to describe Git and its impact on the software development industry. I'd like to describe the relationship between Git and Git hosting sites. Git is the source control tooling that you install locally on your computer to work with versioning and changing code in a distributed manner. Sites like Bitbucket, GitHub, and GitLab are code hosting sites that also add workflows and other features to work with Git. With the rise in popularity of GitHub, followed by GitLab, Git has grown to become the de facto tool of source code management in the last 5 years. It became so standard that the developer surveys no longer ask which source control tool is used, because it's mostly assumed to be Git. Why is this relevant? Well, this makes Git the foundational tool for 90% plus of the world's software developers. This is an extraordinary in terms of mind or market share when it comes to technology choice in the stack for developers globally. In terms of influence, 90+% of the world's estimated 26 million developers use Git. And Git is developed by a core group of less than 100 people. For shaping developer culture, thinking, attitudes, and more, this group of contributors has enormous influence. Git is a member of the Software Freedom Conservancy, which accepts donations on Git's behalf. But a larger donation is found in companies paying their employees to work full-time, devoted to improving Git. These companies include Google, home to the primary maintainer of Git, Junio Hamano, as well as the Git core team. Employees of GitHub, GitLab, Microsoft, and more also work on Git full-time. But in terms of representation, the core contributors to Git were not representative of the wider world at large. Similar to the results of the developer demographic surveys, this small group has almost no racial, ethnic, or gender diversity. So as a first step in contemplating, this meant that in order for Git to be more diverse, equitable, and inclusive, they need to look at the group that provides this code, but also the code and the tool itself. For tooling, one simple but powerful change that could be made straight away was terminology. In summer of 2020, a move was made to change several terms. The most notable being the default branch changed to be called main. GitHub and GitLab made these changes in the fall of 2020. And this is part of a broader effort in open source to contemplate certain terms as being negative or reinforcing negative associations and unconscious bias. Google Open Source blogged about their initiative to have all of Google's projects that are in open source, numbering in the thousands, change their technical terminology to omit certain phrases. If you work in open source and haven't taken an audit of the terminology used in your project, even if it is terminology inherited in your project dependencies or upstream, this is a great first step in making your code and project more inclusive. We come to the second part, preparation. Maintainers of Git core recognized that they needed to do something beyond terminology, that terminology was not enough. Looking inward at the lack of diversity in the project's contributors I just mentioned, and also understanding negative associations and unconscious bias, they decided to look at wider patterns of bias. They also wanted to bring along everyone who played a part in making the Git tool. As you see here in this screenshot, one maintainer does just this in June of 2020. Git does their discussion on the mailing list, a plain text email list that can be read publicly at lore.kernel.org/git. Here you see a maintainer making the suggestion about organizing a virtual contributor summit focused solely on DEI. She also recognized the lack of diversity in the group, which creates perspective gaps to improving that said DEI. Given that we know this group has an enormous influence on a key foundational developer tool, Git knew that in order to succeed in a larger way, it needed to start with the contributors. As a first stage, they invited contributors to a virtual summit that, instead of talking about a wide array of subjects, they would focus solely on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Since that group in of themselves needed more representation beyond, they organized or they brainstormed on ways to get that broader perspective to make change. The group would hire and enlist help from outside experts, focus the event on level setting and education, and manage expectations by coming up with pre-reading material to make sure that attendees did some work and had a certain level of understanding prior to attending. As the event planning started to happen more, extra people expressed interest in helping, and this became a collaboration between Google's software engineers, technical programming managers, the open source programming office, the diversity business partners within Google, as well as Microsoft Open Source Programs Office joining. And as we move from planning to action, this part 3 moves from the philosophical and moral imperatives to those practicalities of running such an event. Depending on the goals you set in the contemplation stage and the plans you made in the preparation stage, This action stage can occur in different steps. They could be all in one or small gradual steps. A couple of practical tips to let you know how to put an event together and what details not to leave out. The first is to ensure high trust. You should always take time to establish ground rules. I'd argue that for every productive event, you need ground rules. Running an event like this doesn't need a lot of tech. We kept it simple. It's appropriate to keep the tooling that the project already uses. In this case, the Git project used the plain text email for the mailing list. We also want to make sure that we give extra care and thought to accessibility, access to. In Git's case, they wanted to continue to use that mailing list for discussion and consensus building. Since many of the attendees were Googlers as well as organizers, we use G Suite tools like Docs, Sheets, Forms, and even Google Draw for planning and executing the event. Lastly, we use a self-hosted Jitsi for video conferencing at the behest of the attendees who wanted an open source video conferencing solution. In fact, at the beginning of planning, we sent out a survey asking for people, or if people had any strong objections to any kind of tooling that we should use. I mention this because how you engage your stakeholders and how you build consensus is as important as what is stated in the event itself. For all but the biggest open source projects, you're going to have a small scale with contributors. Most open source core teams make up only a few people. Work with those contributors that have been involved with the project for a long time. This may not work for every project. You need to think carefully on event goals. Part of the Git project's goals was to bring together the people who had been with the project for a long time, but also try to bring in the right amount of new perspective to enlighten the group while keeping the trust high. You also recognize that many open source projects work asynchronously over many time zones. So this event ended up being 2 half days or 4.5-hour slots that tried to compromise on 15 different time zones. Communicating that compromise and making that compromise easier to do, for example, 4 hours only in the early hours of the morning for Australia instead of a full 8 hours in the middle of the night, will go a long way in ensuring the success of your event. Here are some how-tos and screenshots of artifacts of the event. The left is an event brief with the event purpose, objective, and measurable goals to be able to understand what it is and why you're doing it. So the why. Followed by tactical strategy. Think who, what, or how. You can also keep an appendix of any communication that you had, in our case, the mailing list. And it would serve as a useful reference document, or what we call a home-based document, to come back to over and over again. The second document is a Google form to sign up registrants. You can use other tools that you're familiar and comfortable with, but more importantly, make sure that you understand the tools that your attendees are most comfortable with. Here's the agenda, which included, after much consensus building and stakeholder engagement, training and level setting on half day 1, followed by unconference discussion breakout sessions, which means that they're essentially chosen and voted on by attendees on half day 2. Again, we did have to corral time zones and availability of all the contributors across all the time zones, and we did that using the browser-based whenisgood.net tool. One other bit not shown here is moderator training for discussion leaders, about a group of half dozen who volunteered to take the lead in these discussions. They all attended a brief 1-hour workshop on how best to facilitate conversations approximately 1 week before the summit. For day of details, we made a Google spreadsheet that used that as the place to suggest the discussion breakout topics, and also to have the attendees vote or rate those topics and put the highest rated discussions into the time slots on half day 2. The voting mechanism was simple. We simply asked the voters to add an asterisk or increment it by 1 in the second column. Again, look for the easiest tool to get the job done for the scale that you need. Finally, all the documents were made available to participants on the site here, as well as other information for public consumption. You can use a lot of this for ideas for your event. Lastly, in action, there were many takeaways from the summit. A few listed and grouped here. They include the terminology changes that were discussed earlier, including dead naming or name mapping without making dead names more prominent, a real challenge for a version source control tool. Representation, sponsorship, and mentoring for people that need to have better representation. The mailing list or inclusive project communication, accessibility and localization, code review, including bias and ways to make sure that you keep it friendly and welcoming in an asynchronous mode, attracting beginner-friendly, non-user and non-code contributions to the project, including valuing them, user and contributor documentation, and user experience research. Since the time of recording, there is a name mapping that takes dead naming into account and handles it much better than the previous versions of Git. The other thing I should say as I wrap up the actions is that many of these takeaways are universal among projects, and what to do with them and when is the key for maintaining. As we mentioned maintaining, notes of the summit are linked here. And you can read the full list of projects and all the things that were discussed. Plans for 2021 for Git include additional follow-up summits or summit for contributors and a possible larger event with Git's end users. I want to come to you with 2 conclusions about planning, preparing, and acting on this event. The first is one of my favorite quotes about my job. Software is never done. This describes the cyclical nature of development, whether it's going to be software development or other types of development. And so diversity, equity, and inclusion, by their nature, is and always will be a work unfinished, where a cycle of recontemplation, more preparation, additional and new action, and ongoing maintenance will always be needed. Lastly, my talk subheading was titled Contributor Inclusion Summit, a Butterfly Effect for Open Source Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. A butterfly effect is a phenomenon where one small act can result in large differences later on. When I think of the butterfly effect, I think of this quote by Margaret Mead. Never underestimate the power of a small group of committed people to change the world. In fact, it is the only thing that ever has. For open source developers, maintainers, and project contributors, thank you for changing the world, one merge at a time.
Wow. Thank you, Carmen, for making such a powerful connection between how humans work together on open source software and the topic of DEI. I especially appreciate the reminder that both software and DEI work are never done. So let's head into a live poll. Don't forget to submit your answer on the event page, otherwise you won't be able to see the result. This question asks, have you ever attended any inclusion summits in the last year? Sophia, I'll pose the question to you.
Well, so I haven't attended any events that are specifically designed around inclusion, but my immediate team has been having a monthly DEI discussion group where we meet and discuss various topics. And it's been a wonderful way to continue the conversation, to learn from my colleagues, and to learn other perspectives in a very frank, candid, and controlled format. So I feel like I've participated in many little events and discussion groups on this topic, but no big events.
That's so great. It's always good to have the conversation in whatever setting. Thank you all for participating in the poll. Next, we'll hear a fireside chat from Carolyn, Cinders and Maria Cruz about online harassment and workplace toxicity. Take it away.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this fireside chat. My name is Maria Cruz. I'm a program manager at the Google Open Source Program Office. And I have here with me Caroline Cinders, a machine learning researcher and artist. Caroline and I met while working at the Wikimedia Foundation, and she's here today to talk about remote workplace toxicity and online harassment. Caroline, welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'm Caroline Cinders. I run Convocation Design and Research, a consulting firm where we use design and R&D to analyze complex problems on different kinds of platforms and looking at how technology affects society. So recently I've been working on a report with McKinsey Mac Group and Project Include with Ellen Powell on remote workplace toxicity and harassment with a specific focus on COVID-19 since the COVID-19 stay-at-home orders across the globe have forced workplaces to go from being in person to being totally remote. And within this, we saw a lot of problems start to arise, and we wanted to create a report to try to address different issues we were seeing.
Great. Thank you for being here. I was reflecting on the fact that looking at your work, how you look into words that are used in online conversations from a quantitative perspective. I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit more on the choice of words that we use when talking to each other online. What is the weight that words have in conversation? Why is it so taxing for us when somebody says something mean to us?
For sure. Thank you for that. I tend to look at actions, words, events, and the design affordances of systems around us. So how a person builds a mental model of the technology around them that they exist in. Generally, I look at people inside of networks and platforms. So when I'm studying a problem, I'm looking at how someone may be facing harassment inside of something like Facebook, or how someone can face harm using GitHub, right? So just what the design of that platform is, and then what are the tools someone has at hand to mitigate that harm. And then I'm looking at the different kinds and levels of harm within that. So the words people use, and sometimes the words people don't use. So it's a very multi-pronged problem. One thing that's important to keep in mind, and I'm sure I don't have to spend a lot of time arguing this, I'm sure this audience would agree with me that our online lives are as real as our offline lives. So something that someone says to you online is as hurtful as something someone says to you offline. Like if you were to tell me over video chat that you didn't like my lipstick color, like that wouldn't feel good because I thought we were friends, right? But also that would be a very rude thing to say to the invited speaker. And so while that could be an innocuous statement, how you would articulate that to me, it would still be somewhat hurtful, right? And so what I think is important is to look at the different kinds of words and languages people use in response to harassment. So we can have more direct forms of harassment, like a direct threat, curse words, words that are generally agreed to be harmful, right? And so that can be describing different kinds of abuse, or like leveling abuse at someone. Again, things like curse words or talking about physical harm. But there are also forms of language and actions that may seem more innocuous that are in fact quite toxic. So this is where we are looking at things like microaggressions. So someone saying to you, "You speak so well," and saying that in a surprised way, or just generally saying that, is a form of a microaggression that is toxic. It just may not initially read to someone as toxic. So it's not necessarily innocuous, right? So that phrase, "You speak so well," like you, pause, speak so well, all those as different words may not seem toxic or as toxic as a swear word, but when strung together, it has a sort of cultural and biased weight behind it that is then harmful to the recipient. So I look at things like this, like what are the norms of a group inside of a space, and then what are varying levels of veiled harm that are then leveled at people, and how do we sort of elevate that and talk about that. I'm extremely interested in toxicity and what I think what like more privileged groups could think of as like innocuous harm that is probably as best described as like microaggressions.
I think you're touching on a very interesting topic here, which is what are the different ways in which we can enter conflict in a conversation. I remember a presentation you gave at Wikimania 2017 where you started the conversation by stating that an important distinction, that between conflict, harassment, and abuse. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that difference.
For sure. So I think there are varying levels of interactions and frictions people can encounter. So conflict is really natural. One thing I like to say is community doesn't mean friendship. Just because we're in a community together, that doesn't mean that I need to like you or vice versa. But that doesn't give you carte blanche to be mean to me or be mean to someone else. So communities will naturally have friction within them. People will not get along. And that's actually pretty natural. It's how you manifest that friction and how you respond to someone. That's actually where harassment and abuse can lie. So one thing that's important to think about, I think, is intent versus impact. So someone may say something and not understand the impact of their words. Perhaps there's a cultural difference, perhaps there's a generational difference, perhaps they just said something off the cuff and didn't really think about it. And their intent is not to harm, but the impact of their actions actually causes harm. And I think it's important to look at the impact really rather versus the intent. This is where I really advise communities to create a ladder of consequences. So being able to say this kind of action is going to have this kind of response from us as the organizers. And this is how it matches up to our terms of service, community guidelines, code of conduct, employee handbook, etc. So if someone does accidentally say something and it's considered a lower form of harassment or abuse, we can handle it more as just general conflict, where an intermediary can step in, explain why that was harmful, give an action. So that could be a punitive response, that could be education, that could, say like you have to issue an apology, and then sort of like move on, right? And so when you have this ladder of consequences, you can start to look at actions and say like, well, actually, what is the severity of them and where do they fall within this? And map out responses. You can have a sort of a structured response, and it can be agreed upon response. So, if someone engages in, let's say, physical violence, the ladder of consequences may say, actually, all physical violence results in an immediate dismissal from our community. And we've all agreed upon that because it's in our code of conduct. And we've mapped it in our ladder of consequences, maybe on the top step, which is where immediate dismissal is. So it's really important to be able to understand that not all actions are necessarily abusive. So lower forms of abuse, which we could put into the conflict area, if they continue, especially after someone has said, I'm uncomfortable, please don't do that, those lower forms stack up and can create a very toxic and then very harmful and then very abusive environment. So also like the repeated engagement of bad actions can all needs to be mapped out and analyzed as well. And in my presentation at Wikimania in 2017, that was something I was really interested in, is how do we look at repeating lower forms of toxicity, especially within the Wikimedia universe. So, if someone is constantly correcting you or undoing your edits, that at first can look like conflict, but if it's, if it continues and continues and continues, and you've asked this person to stop, your edits have no reason to be undone or re-edited in any way, that is a form of harassment, because you've asked someone to stop and they are not listening to you setting a boundary, and they're actually invading your boundary.
I see clearly the role of people and moderators in these processes that you describe. I was wondering what role can technology and specifically machine learning play in holding or supporting a code of conduct for a project, for an open source project, for example, or for any online community. How far can we go with using this technology to support these processes?
I don't really know how, what the role should be of technology within this, or rather, I do know, and my advice is often not a big role, because I think to solve human problems, you need human responses. So in the case of moderation, you can use machine learning to try to build a classifier on abusive language. And what you're really building is a keyword filter, I think, at that point, because a lot of harassment and toxicity are the things that we say in context. So someone telling me, or someone even saying to you, you speak so well, that can be extremely harmful, right? But to any kind of tone analyzer or sentiment analysis, that seems almost like a positive statement, right? So I think what's important to recognize is that harassment at times is not very blatant. It's very, very contextual, and or it's tailored specifically to the victim. So machine learning can't help in, I think, analyzing that. What does help, I think, is training with diversity and inclusion experts and racial justice experts to recognize those kinds of interactions when they pop up, for communities to build a plan and a ladder of consequences and implement that plan and that ladder of consequences when harm arises, and to do it quickly and to feel sort of confident in their response. Meaning, I notice this a lot in a lot of different communities I've been in, and particularly also in the Wikimedia community, where people would lean back a little bit and say, well, how do we know that that person, maybe they didn't mean it? And I always like to say, it doesn't really, the intent and impact are very different things. The intent of someone doesn't lessen the impact of their actions or the harm of their actions. I may not intend to hurt you, but I have hurt you. And so I think it's important to separate intent and impact when we're looking at responding to varying levels of toxicity and harm.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely. I think some of the most common misunderstandings or disconnect between people happen when there is that gap between, oh, I actually tried to say X and the impact that had was completely different. So I think acknowledging that's a difference and is probably one of the first steps away from abuse or harassment. Let's go back a little bit to the research project that you're working on right now. You were talking about different information inputs that you were analyzing from different companies that were providing data. And then there's also a survey. Is that right?
Yeah, so we're not actually taking data from companies. We're looking at pre-existing literature that companies have published, their own findings in response to remote work during the pandemic.
What are the next steps when you analyze all of these data? How do you hope to apply this for, is it going to be available for other companies to learn from? Is it going to be accompanied by a guide, or how do you see this project going forward?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that question. It's going to be a research report with specific recommendations for what companies can do right now in this moment. We're confident and hopeful that the recommendations will work for varying size companies, from companies potentially as large as Google to companies as small as a consulting firm of 1 or 2 people, right? So our goal is to really create widespread impact and also think about scale when suggesting different kinds of solutions. And we are thinking about how scale affects implementation. Primarily for us, we are trying to be really actionable also in these recommendations, so they won't be necessarily pie in the sky recommendations, but like things we have learned from conducting our research. I can share a few with you, like what we've started to notice already, though we're still in the process of, we're finishing up research and we're going to start writing soon. So one thing we've learned is that companies really need plans and structure. And I know I've said this earlier, but it's something where they need to have an answer for every kind of scenario that can pop up. So one thing we've seen is companies offer free time or time off available to employees that is time off that you don't have to take vacation for, just like blanket time off during the pandemic. And what we've learned from different people we've interviewed is that particularly when their companies offered this, the company didn't actually make a plan of how someone could access that time off. And then it turned out that time off was actually only available to some employees with children. So one person or a few people we've interviewed had really highlighted wanting to access this benefit, and their managers actually didn't know how they could access that benefit. So the managers had to go up the chain and then figure out actually what that would look like. So the company made time off available, but they didn't also make a plan for who would fill in the gaps of that time off. So who picks up the slack when part of if a third of the company decides to go 50% time. So offering that kind of support is one thing, but you need to have a plan to really implement that support so the company doesn't fall into chaos. And in this case, there wasn't really a plan. Part of the implication was perhaps that the employees that were not taking time off would try to pick up some of the slack, but that doesn't alleviate the employees who are working full-time. That doesn't alleviate their stress or even the general anxiety they could feel in response to, COVID-19 and working from home and the general stress of the pandemic, which is stressful. So one thing we also noticed is people generally feel much more anxiety now than they have before the pandemic. And while that may seem like an obvious takeaway, what that means is if your company is letting some employees take off and others not to, already emotionally taxed employees are now more taxed. They're overtaxed. So that was a big thing. Another thing was we noticed some companies in response to working remotely created no work plan. So some people we interviewed remarked how their day-to-day accountability was actually just like water cooler chats with their manager. So how do we translate a water cooler chat, in a remote workplace? That can be someone just randomly slacking you or sending you a G chat. But while that sounds also innocuous, imagine if you're knee deep in a problem, trying to problem solve something, and your manager just pings you out of nowhere. Trying to switch gears to respond to that can be stressful, especially if you don't know when you're going to get pinged. That also means that at any point in any time, if you got up to go to the bathroom, nobody knows that. And so someone pings you and you come back 20 minutes later, they may be like, where were you? And if you're in a very stressful workplace, they may not trust that you were working and didn't see it. They may make all kinds of assumptions about your work, right? So this is also what I mean is that this lack of structure places a lot of stress on employees because it can be harder for them to show the work that they did during a day because there's no way to there's no outline of what they're supposed to do, right? Or also it just means that they're working in these incredibly stressful short sprints if every day the plan is just tell your boss what you're working on. Like that is not a good project management plan. So this also increases anxiety. Also, people are getting slacked, not during work hours, and then feeling a general anxiety that they should be available, to any message when in fact you are allowed to, not respond to work if it's like 8 p.m. your time and that's not the time you work. So different things like that. Another thing also is some companies we've noticed, because like their way to try to make accountability is to just fill the day with different Zoom calls and different kinds of video calls and check-ins, which also doesn't make an easier work day, because if you spend 6 hours in video calls, when are you supposed to actually do your work? So it's different things like that are actually extremely problematic, and that are really disruptive for people's work styles and are increasing the level of stress that they're feeling.
Yeah. And it sounds like some of the key takeaways, as you were mentioning, is designing more structure for employees, but also designing with a user in mind. So if there are benefits around taking time off, designing that for the people that need it, that may or may not have kids or may not have sick relatives or people they have to take care of. This is really fascinating. I hope that I'm looking forward to reading the report and seeing where this goes. We covered all the topics that we had in our agenda. Is there anything else that I'm missing, or anything else that you would like to that you would like to speak about?
Sure. I mean, I think one thing I want to really emphasize for people listening to this is, right now is a really stressful and taxing time for anybody, regardless of the location they're in and just regardless of who they are. But it is especially stressful for marginalized groups and people of color right now. And that when we're designing things that can feel as, again, mundane as a work structure, those are not mundane structures that will dictate how someone spends, 7 or 8 or 9 of their like waking hours, maybe even more, like 10 or 12, depending upon where someone works. And so one thing I often reflect on is, when I've been working remotely since 2016. And at one place I worked at, so much of my day was just being on video calls that I didn't have enough time in my day to actually do my job, which was doing design research. And my manager didn't really understand that. Like, he didn't understand if I had a meeting and then an hour of free time and then 2 meetings and then an hour of free time, like why I couldn't get my work done. And it was because he was not a researcher, he was a product manager. And trying to explain to him how difficult it is to switch gears from writing to not writing to then answering emails, like that just wasn't possible, proved to be a really hard conversation with him. And so one thing I want people to think about is like, are they giving their employees time to build a work schedule that makes sense for them? So for me, what would have been helpful is like 1 day of work calls, right? And then if, like, let's say in a week, if I needed to have, 15 work calls, like, can I spread that out across 2 days? Like, can I put that in to 2 days of, and that's it? And then like the rest of the week, can I have time for writing, maybe one-on-one feedback from like what I'm writing, etc. Like that would have been a way for me to have been successful in my job. And like my manager made it seem like it was possible for our work to be that flexible when it really wasn't. Like no one would like respect my time if I said like I'm actually full of meetings, right? And meetings being like I'm writing. So that's what I mean. Like I want people to really reflect on that and interact with their employees and ask like, what do you need to be most successful? And then to listen to their employees and give them that space and those boundaries so they can actually succeed during a time where it's really hard. One of our interviewees pointed out something that even though they're single and they don't have dependents, it's really a stressful time for them because they're totally alone. And that even doing basic things like going to the doctor can take 3 times as long, right? Or going and getting groceries. And so these regular mundane things we do are also much, much harder to do. And their schedule wasn't allowing for that. And like their manager didn't seem to understand that either, where it was like, oh, but you don't have a dependent, so why is it hard for you? And it's like, well, it is stressful going to the grocery store if it takes me like 4 hours to do that, you know? Or it is stressful if I get a call from the doctor and they suddenly have something open, otherwise it's a 3-month wait. Like that doesn't, that is stress inducing. And so this is what I mean, where I think companies can't just say that they're listening or that they want to help. They actually have to put that help into practice and design a system that responds to it. Another person mentioned how their workplace was going to have like a day with no meetings, but didn't actually think about, well, how do you redesign our work so we need less meetings? So it's like, okay, if you give us a day with no meetings, do all the meetings have to go somewhere else then, unless we figure out a way to really eliminate meetings, or eliminate some unnecessary meetings. And this is what I mean with a structure. Saying you can have time off or saying we're going to have less meetings, you have to translate that into a structure and a plan that makes space and time for that. That may mean bringing on, for this one company that's like, you can all work part-time, that may mean bringing on more part-time employees so the work can still get done. If another company is saying we want to have less meetings, that means sitting down and saying, like, how can we translate some of these meetings into digital asynchronous stand-ups that happen across like messaging platforms, right? How can we better translate meetings into emails?
Thank you so much, Caroline. Thank you for joining this fireside chat and for sharing what you have learned and what you're learning in the process as well. And we look forward to reading the outcomes of the research.
Yeah, thank you. I'll definitely share them when we're done.
Thank you for that candid conversation, Caroline and Maria. That was really interesting to hear, and a lot of things really resonated me as someone who's been working from home for many months at this point. Particularly this idea of, are you giving your employees the flexibility to build their own work schedules to meet their needs? And I feel like I'm someone who regularly blocks my calendars to ensure that I have time to get things done. But I've also found that in this sort of blended work, personal life, home environment, it's nice to have more structure and to use that aggressive calendar and blocking activity as a way to ensure that I'm at work when I need to be, and then somewhere else or at home when I need to be my personal self. So we're going to have another live poll again on the events page, and we're going to pose this question to you. How long have you been working remotely? Faisal, what about you? How long have you been working remotely?
Yeah, thanks for asking. The role I was in prior to this was fully remote, so I haven't worked in an office for several years now, and I'm really looking forward to getting back to the office when it's safe to do so.
It sounds like a very long time, and I'm sure you have some great tips on how to stay productive there. All right, we're going to move on to the next topic and session. Next, we're going to hear from Jules Good about the best practices for virtual event accessibility. Take it away, Jules.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Engaging Everyone, a presentation about virtual event accessibility. My name is Jules Good, and I'm so excited to be here with you today. So a little bit about me. I am a late deaf person, and I have faced a lot of accessibility barriers in life as I'm losing my hearing, as I'm getting older. And so I'm really passionate about accessibility and helping people be able to access, community events, work events, social things, professional things. And so that's why I'm so excited to be here with you today to chat with you about how you can make your virtual events more accessible. I'm also the founder and consulting lead at an organization called Neighborhood Access. And this is our whole goal, is to work with organizations to make sure that their practices are accessible to people with disabilities. So why should you make your event accessible? First off, disabled people, just like anybody else, care about things and want to get involved in their communities and their professional networks and all of these networks where virtual events would pop up, right? Which is pretty much anywhere. But our needs are often overlooked, even though we have a lot of valuable perspectives to share. And when our access needs are overlooked, that makes it so that we aren't able to participate as fully in events. And that can even discourage people from showing up to events in the first place. And that can just be a super frustrating experience. So you want to make sure that your events are accessible, not only to get more people to your event, but also to make sure that everybody there can participate fully. And lastly, there are more of us than you think. The CDC estimates that 1 in 5 people in the United States has some kind of disability. While not all of those disabilities necessitate accommodations in the virtual world, a lot of them do. And by holding virtual events, you're already meeting some access needs in the first place for people who aren't able to go out and attend events in person. So this is really just about optimizing your virtual events so that everybody can participate fully and have a really great time without all of the frustration and headache of having to, worry about whether things are going to be accessible. So something that I really like to do when scheduling events is to think about accessibility on a timeline. So you want to think about the things you need to do a couple weeks before the event, maybe the week of the event, and then during the event. So those are kind of the 3 chunks that we're going to go through together right now. So at least 2 weeks from your event, you're going to want to pick a platform that has a dial-in option. And what I mean by that is when somebody is viewing the link to the event, you want to make sure that there's an option for them to use a phone number that's connected to the event invitation to dial in with a cell phone, landline, whatever. The reason we want to do that is because a lot of people use relay systems, which are essentially systems that allow people to dial in a captioner or an interpreter to a meeting. So you should absolutely be scheduling an interpreter and or a captioner for your meeting. But if something happens in a pinch where you just have this event randomly pop up and there's no time, then you want to make sure you have that dial-in option so that folks can utilize those relay services. Another really simple thing you can do is ask this question on your event registration page or on the RSVP. Are there any accessibility tools we can provide to ensure you are able to participate fully in this event? And what that does is it just allows you to get a really general idea of what kind of accommodations people are going to need. And that's just really helpful in your planning. For really large events, I would say that, all of these tools that we're about to go through, you should follow just as the standard because you never know who's going to show up. For small events, if you know exactly who's going to be there and exactly what their needs are from asking this question, then, there might be certain things that you can forego if it's just something really tiny. But these are all just really good things to keep in mind in general, because again, you never know if some random person is going to show up who has an accommodation that you didn't plan for. And so it's good to just plan for it and be ready to deliver on that accommodation if necessary. Another thing you need to do a couple weeks out from your event is schedule an interpreter and or a captioner. So there's kind of a hierarchy of these things that I like to think about. If you're able to schedule an interpreter and a captioner, you absolutely should. The only thing that really limits organizations from doing both is budgetary restrictions. But if you're able to do both, you totally should, because both are really helpful. The reason why is because a lot of people think that English and ASL, American Sign Language, are the same language. They're not. They're really different. ASL has its own grammar, its own structure, its own syntax. And so people who grew up with ASL as their primary language might have a harder time reading captions at the speed that speech is being delivered. So having an interpreter is really helpful to provide full access, especially to culturally deaf people. And then on the flip side of that, captions are really helpful for people who don't know sign language, but are still hard of hearing or might have some other kind of auditory processing disorder. And so you really want to have both to cater to the widest range of needs possible. If you can't, I would say second from having both would be just having the captions, because a lot more people can benefit from captions. And then for whatever reason, if you can't find captions at all and you're only able to get an interpreter, then of course that would be kind of at the bottom of the list. Absolutely, it's better than nothing and will help people, no matter what. So you should definitely do that if that is your only option. But if you can do both, that would definitely be what I would suggest. Moving to 1 week out from the event. So this is really all about formatting your materials and preparing them so that they are optimized for accessibility. So the first thing you should do is prepare to share your slides or your documents or any visual aids with attendees. In some situations, it may not be possible to share these prior to the event, but if you can, you absolutely should. The reason that this is really helpful is for people who use screen readers. So a screen reader is a piece of software that blind and low vision people use in order to have text that is on a screen read to them out loud. So it's like the opposite of speech to text that we use on our phones. It's text to speech. And so this is a really important tool for people to give them access to any text or anything that you would read on a screen. And so the issue with having slides or documents, if you're screen sharing them on a teleconferencing platform, is that the screen reader doesn't recognize what's on the video as being text. It just says, oh, that's a video. I don't have to read anything to whoever's using me because there's no text here. So when you are able to share slides and documents ahead of time, then people can use their screen readers. They'll know what to prepare for it. They'll have full access to the materials. They won't have to play catch up after the fact. So it's great to just be proactive with accessibility in that regard. Another thing that's important when you're formatting your visual materials is to add alt text, which is sometimes also called image descriptions. So this is also a screen reader related accommodation. So when a screen reader comes across a picture on your screen, unless there's alt text, it just says, oh, there's a picture. I don't have to do anything with that. And then the person using the screen reader doesn't have access to whatever is in that image. So when we add alt text, it basically sends a message to the screen reader that says, hey, this is what's in this picture. So let's do an alt text practice with this picture of me and my dog here. So if I were to add alt text to this image, I would say, this is a picture of a small black chihuahua curled up on a person's lap, and they are maybe sleeping. So super simple. You're just giving an idea of what's going on in the image. Doesn't have to be super, super detailed. Notice I didn't talk about, the pattern on my shirt or what's going on in the background. It's just an idea of whatever the most important content of that image is. The next thing you're going to want to do is format your materials with headings and proper fonts. So obviously this is for materials that have text associated with them. So if you have long documents, you want to make sure that those have headings, and not just headings that you make by hitting, Control B and making something bold or italicized or whatever, but headings that are selected from your word processor's settings to say like, oh yeah, this is heading 1, this is heading 2, this is normal text, this is a subheading, yada, yada, yada. And that is helpful for screen readers in terms of understanding the organization of the page so that it can read to the person using the screen reader a lot more coherently and not have it just be like a random stream of words. And with fonts, what we want to consider is serif versus sans serif fonts. So serif fonts are fonts like Times New Roman or Gothic that have, those little lines kind of at the edge of each part of the letter. And sans serif fonts would be fonts like the ones on this slide that don't have any of those little lines. So it's just like the simplest kind of smoothest form that the letter can be in. And the reason it's important to use sans serif fonts is because the serif can make it more difficult for people, particularly people with visual processing disorders like dyslexia, to discern between letters. It makes it easier for things to kind of get jumbled together when we have all those extra lines. So the cleanest, most sans serif font that you can find is going to be the best way to go. Another thing that you should do is provide the interpreter with a list of key terms. I know with all of our tech meetings and our industry specific terms, there's a lot of jargon in there that sometimes we don't even think about. And you want to make sure that any of those acronyms, those proper nouns, names, any really technical language, you are giving the interpreter a heads up of the kind of language that you're going to be using. So just like a list of those words, super easy. And that way they're able to prepare for that ahead of time, practice finger spelling, any words that are like super long or complicated, or maybe finding the signs for words that aren't as commonly used. So that is just going to be super helpful for your interpreter in the meeting. And lastly, as you're setting the agenda for your meeting, you're going to make sure that you're scheduling breaks into the event. So I like to follow the 35 rule, which means that for every 30 minutes of, lecture style presentation, like right now where I'm like just kind of talking at you, that you provide a 5-minute break after each of those 30-minute segments. And, it's not always possible to follow this. And I understand that different schedules and different agendas call for different things, but just try to scatter a couple short breaks throughout your event. This is not only good for people who might struggle with attention, people like me with ADD, who just have a really hard time sitting still, but also for folks who have maybe medical needs that come up throughout the day, or bathroom related needs where, they're just going to need a little bit of time to just do that self-care, make sure that they've got, all their medication and all of that stuff figured out, so that they are at the top of their game for the duration of your event. And lastly, we have the things you should do during your event. So the first of these would be audio cues, and these kind of come into two forms. The first would be your initial introductions, and the second is throughout the event. So in the initial introductions, you just want to give a quick visual description of yourself. And what this does is it helps people who are blind or low vision just kind of have some verbal thing to remember you by other than the sound of your voice. So when I say like, oh, hey, it's Jules talking, they can be like, oh yeah, that's the person who said they were wearing a yellow blazer. Like I kind of remember, how to distinguish them from somebody else. And so the initial introduction, you just want to say like, this is how I would do mine if I was in a meeting right now. Hi, I'm Jules. I have brown hair. I'm white. And I am wearing a yellow blazer with a green shirt underneath and some rainbow colored earrings. Any of what you want to say in that visual description is optional and up to you. But if you can just give, a quick overview of what you look like, any kind of key accessories or whatever you're wearing, that is really helpful for folks. And then the other type of audio cue is what you do during the event. So this is not only helpful to blind and low vision folks because, keeping track of the sound of everybody's voice, especially if you've just met them, is really difficult. So when you're switching between speakers, just make sure that you reintroduce yourself real quick when it's your turn to speak again. So it's helpful in that regard. And then it's also helpful for folks who are using interpreters, because then the interpreter can say, oh yeah, that's Jules talking, or oh yeah, that's Dan talking, or whoever, so that the person who's relying on the interpreter for communication can also have an easier time keeping track of who's speaking at what time. Another thing that's really important is content warnings. So these are especially important because there are certain visuals or sounds that can trigger people to have different reactions, even as serious as triggering a seizure or a panic attack or something that is just really not going to be a fun time when you're on screen with a bunch of different people. So there are kind of 3 things that you definitely want to make sure you include content warnings for. If you have any visuals that have flashing lights, like a really commonly known one is strobes, but just kind of flashing lights in general. Any rapidly transitioning graphics. So if you're like going through a, slideshow of photos at like 1,000,000 miles an hour or something, you want to make sure you put a content warning for that. And then also any sudden and especially sudden loud noises. those can be really bothersome for folks. So just a couple minutes before those things happen, or even, give people a 10-second countdown before those things happen, is really just going to help to keep the participants of your meeting safe. And while we often don't think about safety in terms of, maybe virtual events, this is definitely an area where safety is really important. Another thing you should do is to prepare for interpreter questions. So, sometimes your internet might cut out, or there's some background noise that's like making it hard to understand what you're saying. The interpreter is going to cut in and say, hey, I didn't understand what you said. Can you repeat that? And that's because they want to make sure that, the person who's relying on the interpreter for communication has full access to the information that's being relayed. Just prepare for those questions related to clarification, because that's really going to be helpful for the folks who are relying on the interpreters. And lastly, we want to make sure that we're describing visual elements verbally. So let's do an example of that together right now. So if I was going to describe this graph in a way that a blind or low vision person could understand it, I would say this is a pie chart that shows the number of points that each team scores. Team 1 scored 21.8%. Team 2 scored 32.7% of points, Team 3 scored 10.9% of points, and Team 4 scored 34.5% of points. So now you've just, described basically what's going on in this chart. Now, there are situations where if you have a gazillion data points, it's not going to be effective or, time effective to describe each point like I just did. So you can say just kind of the general trend of the graph. So if this pie chart, for example, had like a lot more data points, but Team 4 had still scored the biggest amount of points, I would say, here's a pie chart. There's a lot of information here, but we can see that Team 4 scored the most amount of points and Team 3 scored the least amount of points. So you just kind of want to identify the pieces of information that are important, and then make sure that you're communicating those verbally and not just pointing them out visually. And that will make sure that everybody has full access to, the information that you're trying to describe. And that brings us to the end of the presentation. I just want to remind you, hopefully as COVID dies down and we're able to start having in-person events again, that you should continue to have a virtual event option when you have in-person events. Like I was saying earlier, there's a lot of folks who aren't going to be able to make it out to in-person events for a variety of reasons. So having that virtual option will really improve engagement with your event. And, I hope that when you do continue having virtual events, that you will use these tips and tricks and that you will be able to facilitate an event that really is engaging and meaningful and inclusive of everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jules, for those great insights on how to ensure virtual events are accessible to everyone. I do hope we continue to have thoughtful virtual programs even as we begin to return to the workplace. Next up, we'll go to the live poll. How accessible do you find the current state of virtual events? Sophia, how would you answer this question?
I feel like I want to pick the extreme opposites here, in that I've experienced both highly accessible events. In one example, last year I participated in a local developer open source meetup in Rwanda that I, for a 15-minute presentation, probably would not have flown halfway around the world. And it was kind of incredible to be able to interact with a totally distinct and different community in a different country. But at the other hand, attending large live streamed events has been very challenging to stay engaged and feel connected to the rest of the attendees as we're all kind of watching this in a one-to-many format. So I feel like I've seen both extremes of this. And I think there's always going to be room for improvement in any model.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Thanks everyone for your input there. Next, we'll hear from Annie Jean-Baptiste and Liane Ihara about Google's product inclusion journey. Take it away.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Product Inclusion at Google session. My name is Annie Jean-Baptiste, and I lead Product Inclusion at Google.
And my name is Leanne Ihara, and I lead Product Inclusion for Platforms and Ecosystems.
At Google, we talk a lot about building products for everyone, but we also believe that it's important to build products with everyone because you can't assume you know what someone needs without asking them. It's critical that teams ask who else needs to be in the room, who else needs to be at the table, so that we can collaborate and co-create with voices that have historically been at the margins. Google's mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. So that means no matter where you are in the world, who you love, how much money you make, or what color your skin is, or any of the things that make you you, you should feel that Google is helpful to you in the moments that matter most. And so product inclusion is really about not just building for some, but building for billions of people all over the world. Product inclusion is unique because it brings 12 dimensions of diversity and the intersections of those dimensions to the table. It builds on amazing work like accessibility work, but again, looking at intersections of multiple dimensions of diversity and how that affects a user's experience. You're seeing some of the dimensions of diversity on this slide, things like gender, race, age, ability, and more. Using myself as an example, I'm a Black woman who's also left-handed. It's not like I'm Black on Monday, left-handed on Tuesday, and a woman on Wednesday. All of these things are a part of who I am, and they affect how I move through the world, how the world interacts with me, and how I interact with products. So if I'm using scissors, for example, being left-handed is the only thing that is going to be predominant. But if I'm trying to take a photo, being Black and a woman can intersect. Product inclusion is an end-to-end system, so it's not just a checklist or point in time. And we really try to encourage teams to make sure that they're thinking about product inclusion at critical points in the product design process. So what you're seeing here are what we call inflection points, or points where teams can really be proactive about bringing that inclusive lens. Teams can come in at any point, but we really try to prioritize bringing product inclusion in as early as possible so we can take learnings at each of the phases and build on them so that it cascades through a truly helpful product at the end. We've also found that there are 4 points where teams keep coming back to time and time again, and those are the ideation, user research and design, user testing, and marketing phases, which we'll talk about in a little bit. It's important to also talk about the business case for inclusion. There's a misconception that underrepresented groups don't have power, and that's simply not true. So what you're seeing here are some stats around different underrepresented groups. For example, there are 1 billion people in the world with a permanent disability. We're seeing trillions of dollars in purchasing power from Black and Hispanic Latinx consumers. And there are 700 million people who are coming online in the next few years from places like Nigeria. So it really behooves any business and organization to think about how they bring those perspectives, voices, and needs of these historically underrepresented users into the center and really highlight them in product design. As I mentioned, there are 4 main points in the product design process where we've really focused on with product teams. This is done because over a year, we did some research on the business case for inclusion, and we found that these were points that were really impactful in the output of our product teams and for our products and services. And those are the ideation, user research and design, user testing, and marketing phases. We found that teams that were acting with an inclusive lens did so at least 2 of the 4 process points. So that may be ideation and marketing, that may be user research and user testing, but I think that signals that it's not just a box to check. We really want teams to think holistically about product inclusion and think holistically about their product design process and how they can make it more inclusive and equitable. We also found that both underrepresented and majority groups prefer inclusive marketing and product design. So this may be surprising to some, and they may think that only underrepresented groups want to see themselves reflected accurately and beautifully. But actually what we found were the majority of users actually wanted to see that. And so I think we'll continue to see trends like this where consumers are really expecting brands to reflect the beautiful diversity of the world around us. We also found that regardless of makeup, teams that proactively think about product inclusion, are intentional about setting goals, can create more inclusive products, regardless of their team makeup. I think this is very encouraging because even if teams are working to get to representation that accurately reflects the world around us, they can still build more inclusive products. They just have to be intentional, proactive about it, and really think about accountability for themselves and their teams. And now we'll go into some examples of what product inclusion looks like in action. The first one is our Black-owned business attribute, which is a part of our racial justice work streams. When a business wants to denote that they're Black-owned, they're able to do this and have this icon on Google Search and our other properties. This is really exciting because people can celebrate, highlight, and traffic these different Black-owned businesses. We've also seen a lot of work done to make sure that all skin tones render accurately. So here's a quick video of the work that we've done with Google Camera.
Pictures tell stories. It doesn't really matter if it's a selfie or if it's a portrait that somebody is taking of another person. You are sharing in that human moment.
Let's take a picture of you two. 1, 2, 3. No, he's too dark.
So this is where the discussion started.
Here, just use my phone. It's got a better sensor.
A better sensor? What does that even mean?
Color tuning is an extremely complicated process. When we look at images, what we try to do is figure out how much of a difference there is between, let's say, a reference image and the image that we actually are trying to quantify. We were running some tests on a product, and it was the proximity sensor we were testing. And we said, oh, it looks like it does 60 centimeters. And we looked at each other and go, we're both white. The technology itself, as many people will say, is not racist. It's just that it wasn't tested properly to make sure that the designers weren't unconsciously biased. Hey, there's an entire world out there and we want to make sure this works for everybody. I love the fact that we get to influence cameras, that we get to share those experiences of life and emotion. And to me, that is what imaging is about. It is a vehicle to express humanity.
Take a picture of you two. 1, 2, 3.
Thanks, Annie. Those are great examples. I'd like to dig into what's involved in delivering an inclusive camera experience. And to do that, I want to use the work that's taking place in the Android team. So they've embarked upon this multi-year journey to systematically increase face diversity with really a goal of providing more inclusive face detection. And to understand their goal of face detection is to realize that for digital photography, face detection really can impact how skin tone is rendered, subject focus, and even exposure metering. So the way they did that was to systematically look at how they're testing both the front and rear facing cameras, and to come up with a consistent approach to testing. And you can see in the upper right-hand corner, this was their original starting test. And what they realized was that you didn't have consistent results over time to be able to detect faces in that scene. And so they started they neutralized the background, they neutralized the clothing that the subjects wore, and then they also increased the size of the faces that comprise the scenes. And with this consistent framework for measurement, they started to layer in different dimensions of diversity, such as gender, race, looking at physical attributions such as hair or glasses, accessories, and most recently in Android R, they incorporated age diversity as part of the scenes for testing. And these tests are then carried out by all of the OEMs that build products on Android. And so what you have then is an increasing performance and an improvement in the ecosystem over time. When we think about product inclusion, there are 3 principles that hold true. And the first principle is address the user. And what we're talking about here is really understanding the 12 dimensions of diversity that Annie mentioned earlier, and really thinking about how they come together for users in the product. We want to think very holistically about the user and understand how Historically marginalized users can be brought to the center and part of our focus when we are developing products. The second principle is start with equity. And there are a couple of things that we want to keep in mind when we think about this principle. And this principle is really about ensuring that at every stage of the product development lifecycle, equity and product inclusion is a real focus for us, and that it's not just an afterthought. And how we actually activate this second principle is about understanding who's represented in the product, and more importantly, who's not, and asking who else we need to bring to the table to really influence the design direction and the decisions that we're making about the product. And in order to do that, we need to understand what the critical user journeys are for the product, the key performance indicators, and we need to be able to measure performance and how different users are actually interacting with the product, and how well or how not so well they're actually succeeding in the kinds of outcomes that we intend for them to experience. And the last principle is about continually testing. So we all have these going in assumptions about the product and how it'll land. And we want to be able to measure how the product actually lands. And then we also want to be able to refine the product over time based on feedback that we're receiving from users in the field. When we think about product inclusion, it's not something that a single individual or a single team can do, but it's really about a commitment and a value that takes place across the entire company. It's a commitment to intention, if you will, and really the intention to take a stop and listen, and more importantly, to take action on the feedback that you're receiving from individuals. And what we found is that when you actually focus on and center on these underrepresented voices, the end product is beneficial for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie and Leanne. Diversity, equity, and inclusion have been an ongoing commitment for many companies, including Google. And I thought it was great to see all of the different kinds of roles and functions that are involved in bringing in and ensuring perspective across the product design and life cycle. And I say that's something that maybe project leads can learn from, as in smaller communities, there's maybe only a handful of engineers that are working on any given project. And this kind of really highlights the need for an extended list of individuals with a variety of background and function to ensure that you are bringing in this idea of inclusion for all at all stages of your project and the expansion of your project. So that's the end of our content for today's event. I feel like I've learned a lot. I think in particular, one of my key takeaways was from Jules' session in virtual event. And I give a lot of presentations and I put up a lot of data, and often I organize it in a way that ensures my participants and recipients can glance at it and get a gist of what I'm trying to accomplish or state in that slide. But I have to remember that not everyone can see it or see it clearly. And I think I would love to have more visual cues to help others that are maybe less able to see what's in front of them. So I thought that was a great tip. Faisal, what about you? What did you learn from this today?
Yeah, so many great takeaways. I think one thing that stood out for me, I'm all about the numbers. And so I believe it was Annie Jean-Baptiste who mentioned that 700 million more people will come online in the next year alone. And I think thinking about how we include them most effectively is an interesting challenge that I'm looking forward to.
Absolutely agree. Okay, well, that's a wrap. It's almost time for the after party. We've updated the Google Meet link to join it, the after party. Please look for a button in the agenda page. Today's speakers will also be joining us, and we'll have some polls, some interactive activity, and a surprise guest.
Awesome. I hope to see you all there. Thank you.